All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. There have been a lot of jokes this afternoon. That saves me the pain of having to come up with one. And having the force to keep you awake. So I'll spare you with more jokes, and talk about the subject here. I just want to clear the air about coming from Kenya. I know that creates some concerns. Who is this Kenyan to tell us about conservation? I'm not here as a Kenyan, okay? I'm here as Iucn, and I worked all over the continent of Africa and outside. And thank you very much for the introduction. I also lecture in a number of universities in Eastern Africa. So as you can see, I do have something of use to tell you this afternoon. And I promise you, put you to sleep. At least I hope not. Dr. Bandile Mkize, I met him this morning. A very exciting discussion in his office. And I'm sure as Iucn, we'll be able to collaborate a lot more than we have in the past. He did point out that actually they are better than sun parks. In fact, repeatedly, until I finally got the point, because Iucn has, I must say, worked a lot more with sun parks than KZN wildlife. And I'm ashamed to say that we could have and should have done the opposite. Not necessarily opposite. I'm sure there are people from sun parks here. I meant a lot more also with the KZN, but there's still hope with Iucn. Dr. Jean Harris, thank you very much for the invitation. You insisted over and over again that I make sure that I do come out. And thank you very much for having us here. The representative of the MEC for KwaZulu-Natal, Department of Agriculture and Environmental Affairs, Jeffrey Zikali, who I've just met, an excellent speaker too. And the many sponsors I've seen on the board here who have come forward to sponsor this symposium. I must say, I'm very impressed with the gathering here, the participation, and more importantly with the sponsorship. This sort of partnership is rare on the continent and in my region, and I'm always impressed by what you in South Africa continuously do in collaboration. And I hope this is a normal pattern which is exemplary and should be followed in other countries as well. Now I've followed the protocol, so if you don't mind, I'll go straight to my presentation. And I should say I'm very happy that we started late, because I was at pains to come up with a 40-minute presentation, and keep people awake for 40 minutes is not really an easy thing to do in the afternoon. So I'm happy we started late, and I'll try and pick up speed as we proceed so that you can have enough time for your coffee break. The agenda is very packed from what I saw, with so much of the subjects that I've seen on the program. And in my opinion, these are the most critical aspects that face us today on the continent as a whole. And I wish actually, of course it's a very tall order to ask if this could be opened up to a lot more countries other than South Africa, because the topics that you're going to be discussing actually would be important for a lot more people outside South Africa to listen to and contribute to. So it's a challenge that you may want to consider in future, inviting participants from other countries as well. It's a very unique gathering and discussion, I assure you. I have participated in a number of other workshops and seminars and symposiums and conferences and so on around the continent. This has something special. I'm not just saying this because you invited me, but it's the truth. I think it's a lost opportunity if it's just kept within South Africa. And I'm throwing the challenge back to Dr. Mkhize, because he's the one who told me that we in South Africa, and I quote, it's not me as a Kenyan, I'm quoting him, we in South Africa think we know all about conservation, and it's not true. We can learn from others, and I think the reverse is also true. So please do consider this in future. Now, before I go on, I'm just assuming that not everyone here knows about Iucn, and I also have a duty to make sure that I talk something about my organization before we proceed. I'm sure there are only a few of you who don't know about Iucn, I hope. So just give me a few minutes to talk about Iucn itself. I think it's an important organization to you as well. So, and I hope I get this thing right as well. There you go. Okay, Iucn stands for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which has also been known in the past, I think, mostly as the World Conservation Union. This is a membership organization, and what's unique about it is that it has both government as well as NGO members, and not just one or the other, with equal voice. That's the difference to other membership organizations, including the United Nations, where the NGOs, maybe if they're lucky, they might get a chance to say something in a few seconds. With Iucn, it's different. We give an equal opportunity to both government as well as NGOs to speak about conservation. They don't always just speak about conservation, of course. Now, I represent the Eastern and Southern Africa region, which covers about 25 countries, including the Western Indian Ocean, from Eritrea, Djibouti, right down to, or around to Angola, and all the island states in the region. It's a sizable region, and that's why I'm very keen to make sure that we share experiences in the region. South Africa specifically is very well advanced in a number of areas in terms of conservation, but it can also learn from others, as I said. So I hope that we'll continue with this program in future. Now, the title of this presentation drew me very much, and I was asked if I want to change the title, but I refused, and I think it's important because there are things that are relevant to the continent now that I feel are important to be transmitted to the audience. Let's first of all look at the word contemporary. I think it's important that we look at the term in reality and what it implies to conservation today. The human race is perhaps exactly that. It's a race in speed. It's a race of numbers, as you know. It's a race of superiority on the continent, a race for affluence and influence. Our population numbers, as you may know, are fast approaching a stage of breaking point on the continent, when resources will not be sufficient to support survival, no matter where you are or when in time. There is some comfort that there's still many years to come before we in a particular country begin to feel the pain of surviving. But that's not the case. This time is approaching very fast. The time between each billion is lessening as we go on, and a similar exponential decline in biodiversity loss caused largely by this very increase in human demands and activities is also equal. Now, urbanization is on the rise, as you know very well, especially here in South Africa. And this is more so in developing countries everywhere on the continent. Infrastructure is increasing everywhere. Changes in the economic, social, and political structures, frequently through conflict, as you well know on the continent. In many cases, these changes, or I should say in most cases, these changes are unplanned. And the effects, the adverse effects, are subsequently or consequently more serious and difficult to mitigate because of the unplanned manner in which these changes are occurring on the continent. Economies of the region continue to lay emphasis on growth. And it's always about growth. We want to continue growing everything on the popular assumption that more growth equals more prosperity and well-being. And while even that is not seen in all sectors of society, as you well know, this growth may not affect the entire society or communities in a country, and is sectoral specific in many countries. It still does not take into account that this prosperity to whom it benefits only also means changes in lifestyles, diets, etc., and the inevitable consequences of this on our natural resource base and the environment that we live in. There's more and more being drawn from natural resources in every country on the continent that we live in. There are many examples to prove this point, but let me pick on one which, strange as it may seem, it nevertheless is true. A report found, and this is a bit uncomfortable, especially in South Africa, a report recently found that red meat is responsible for 10 to 40 times more greenhouse gas emission than common vegetables and grain. And this is true. I'm not just making this up. This is a report that actually says red meat is responsible for all that greenhouse emission. Now, I'm not really an ardent advocate of vegetarians, and I'm sorry if there are many of you here. I'm a dedicated predator. And I'm ironically among the sad majority of bipedal carnivores who are present in this room. I'm sure I'm not mistaken being in South Africa. The point, however, here is that there is need to also heavily weigh the negative effects of prosperity while we herald the good times of prosperity. And a number of the topics that you'll be discussing, I believe, talk about this particular aspect. Globalization, another offspring of contemporary times. Today, demand and supply is not merely a national or regional issue, and by no means is it constrained by geographical or political boundaries. What is lacking in one country can easily be acquired from another. The means and methods are not always important or scrupulous, as we see in more than a few countries in our continent. Now, I have to be very diplomatic about this, so that something's wrong with your pointer. I'm trying to use the red light. Oh God, I hate these things. Right. Now this picture here, I think is self-explanatory, unless you want me to explain. I can very comfortably explain this, but I think maybe over coffee I can talk to you more about this. But the point here is exactly what I said. What is lacking in one country nowadays in this globalization scenario is being acquired from another country. And there's a point there that I wish you would remember as you proceed with your discussions. And this cycle here is actually a symptom of what's going on in a number of countries on the continent. Outside interests take over local interests, and the results following that, eventually, this is the change of the environmental situation in a particular country. Not only are boundaries on these particular fronts being dissolved, technology is playing a huge contributing factor. The internet, mobile telephone, etc. will continue to make access to information and communication easier and faster. Now, you may ask, so what if all this is in the contemporary? What has changed in as far as conservation is concerned? Okay. First, the time to act changes exponentially. By its very nature, this implies that as changes happen very quickly, we have less and less time over time to make decisions, and even less time to act. We are not strange to events occurring in the last decade when countries just recovering from one disaster are confounded by another. Before we have a chance to restore one ecosystem, another is in danger. And I'm sure this is the case even in this country. Before we bring one species from the brink of extinction, another and others are listed as near extinction. And I'm not even going to talk about those that are threatened or in danger of extinction on the continent. Secondly, the complexity of the situation is different. We can no longer operate on the premise that one set of actions will lead to a predictable change that we have seen in the past. Our traditional way of planning and thinking and traditional set of outcomes and indicators can no longer provide the sense of comfort that we have been used to as conservationists. I mean, you wouldn't be surprised that energy is no longer MC square. Things have changed tremendously in the last couple of decades especially. Just to point out a couple of examples of an emerging pattern of this in contemporary times. Protected areas. Protected areas which have been established with the comfort of believing that it would on its own secure biodiversity. I don't need to tell you how this came to be a folly. And practitioners the world over have had to find solutions to threats which were by and large unforeseen. There are a lot of you protected areas people in the room spending sleepless nights of what's going to face you tomorrow. And all the innovative responses that we come up with constantly also have to change according to this changing situation. We will need to step up on raising the profile of our protected areas is another point. If we are to make them relevant in the general mindset of the body politic. It is disturbing that the value of these key biodiversity areas are still not only seen, they are seen at most as tourism products, as you well know. Even then, this is quickly forgotten when faced with a conflict between wildlife and man. I don't need to explain more about this. You know the situation very well. In most countries in Africa, protected areas are principally there recognized only as a tourism product and not valued for the biodiversity that's in there. And this is the case, that case is very pertinent in Eastern Africa, where if tourism goes down, there's talk about degazetting protected areas and turning them into settlements and estates and farms and so on. This is reality that as conservationists we are faced with. Now here's another example of contemporary situation in Africa. I'm sure you already are ahead of me on this point. How about the traffic and trade in wildlife products? I just came from a meeting discussing bushmeat trade in southern Africa, for that matter. And it's something that even I have been surprised about. But there are shocking figures existing in southern Africa. Of course, we've always had sustainable use of wildlife and its products on the continent. It's been a tradition for many years, for thousands of years, I should think. But who thought that one day it would become what it is today? A total war on using any and all means available to acquire a mere part of an animal, and has grown now to become a thriving covert industry in itself. Not always covert, it's even overt in many countries. And it requires all manners of infrastructure to manage. You're already grappling with rhinos and elephants here. There are other countries which are grappling with literally every species in the country. Now I'm sure you've seen worse pictures than that. A whole new set of factors and actors hitherto not of vital relevance have become the deciding factors of today. These are political, social, and of course economic factors, and that's reality on the continent. These have become the priorities in developing countries. Sadly, despite various sound arguments backed by facts from conservationists on the inextricable reliance of all those priorities I've just mentioned on viable ecosystems and biodiversity therein, it has still not resonated sufficiently in the minds of those who ultimately make political decisions. I mean, we hear a lot about politicians talking about how important the environment is, how important wildlife is, but when it comes to factual decision making to support conservation and the environment, it's a whole different thing altogether. Now, if I may, I would like to point out one such example on this, but I'm sure there are better experts in the room than I in the audience who can reel out many more examples in this country and in Africa. Now, Africa is grappling today with solutions on how to feed its growing populace faced with poor rainfall, land degradation, and poor soils. They are by far the most common causes of declines in productivity. If you look carefully around the nations, forests have been cut down, burnt down, water bodies have been drained and neglected, and yet there is little, if any, emphasis to address one of the main causative factors of that decline, and that is better management of the environment. Simply that, better environment management. Instead, we will see more attention on roads, fertilizers, machinery, and yes, sadly, even on relief food in many countries. And this is done in a predictable cycle of misery year in, year out. Yet we don't address the very basic causative factor, and that's sound environmental management. This thing has a mind of its own. Now, as you can see, there has already been work done on the very subject that I'm referring to, and that's a good management of whatever practice that we have, building in environmental elements or environmental factors into your planning in whatever you do. Now, Iucn has long made available information to help governments to refer to in making these decisions. The information is there, it's available. There's a lot more out there to help make the right decisions by us. And these are not recent publications, these are old publications, that we can use the elements of the environment in food security, in all aspects of development. More recently, to make things worse, it is concerning, in fact, alarming, to hear of precious land being leased out in Africa, and this is a reality in many countries, some that are very close to your country as well, and even sold to other countries to produce food. Here's the irony: to produce food in Africa to take to their countries. And this is happening in a lot of countries. I'm not at liberty to mention names in my position, unfortunately, but soon I'll be retiring, so I can talk about specific names of countries that have come to this continent, made deals with certain countries to lease land, even buy land to develop for agricultural purposes, and that crop, that produce, goes back to their countries, isn't sold here. Surrounding that land are communities that get relief food. Just think about that, because this is the case in a lot of countries on the continent. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, it is a question of priorities as it appears in the minds of these decision makers and planners. The environment and all things environment, as I say, do not factor as a vital component in most African countries as one of the primary drivers of growth itself. This growth at the pace it's continuing without the element of environmental management cannot be sustained, and it's going to destroy the rest of the survival, rather, of the countries and the populations. Conservationists have had to modify and modernize our approaches and language to try and squeeze fit into these minds by presenting economic values, and I see some of the topics are going to be discussing values of certain ecosystems and so on. Social arguments, we've used social arguments as well to try and convince the decision makers, and sometimes I know some of you also here try to get emotional and get some emotional reaction from politicians so they would listen to you. It's not a bad thing, by the way. If it works, why not? Unfortunately, as long as the growth concept in our minds is linked to the more syndrome, that's more money, more cars, more houses, more electricity, more people, you know what I mean. This human response to the future will always pose a serious challenge to the conservation of nature when we have precious little time to change. However, having said all this, and for the record, well, I'm a firm advocate for the inclusion of the environment in national accounting systems, and that's a very important thing for us going forward, is to ensure that the environment is somehow captured in the national budgeting and accounting system as a way for the future. However, I think it's important also that we need to be careful when we are talking about valuing ecosystems, valuing biodiversity, which, as I said, is a vital improvement if we are to do it properly. I think it's also important that we don't allow this to be the only driver of improvement in environmental management. Because just like credit and mortgages, this whole aspect of valuing biodiversity may be like an invisible bubble. After a while, there'll be another argument that'll be required in future. What I'm saying is just let's be careful in how we do this. It's important, it's necessary to put a value on biodiversity and ecosystems, but remember who you are talking to when you're doing this. It could easily be turned around and become something different, as I've seen in some countries. Now, it's important to arm ourselves with contemporary weaponry in terms of concepts, no doubt. But as we strive to communicate better and get our messages across to the other sectors, let this not divert us from the original values, as I was saying, and do our very best to equally argue against the value system itself, which is placing this burden on natural resources. We are constantly being asked as conservationists to prove what is the value of your ecosystem, what is the value of your protected area, and so on. Now, on the continent, we've seen noble and innovative advances in some countries to strike a balance between the need to develop and the necessity to conserve. But these advances need to be sustained in an environment of focused attention on development where considerable more funding is being given by new and emerging donors. I just want to emphasize the new and emerging donors whose focus is not on environmental management, is not to assist countries improve environmental management. On the contrary, it's more about developing infrastructure, developing urbanization, and so on and so forth, drawing the attention from environmental management and putting it all on growth of the country in terms of those factors. We will need to not only upscale the whole aspect of access and benefit sharing with more clarity. There's a lot of talk about access and benefit sharing. How can we empower communities? How can we improve their lot and so on? But we need to have very clear approaches and clear intentions on how we do this. But we also be realistic and ensure sustainability to be the foundation of this approach. We have seen far too many examples of that approach without sustainability being built into it fail. And when they fail, they have a serious repercussion and reversal effect on what you were trying to implement in the first place. So let's be very careful when you go down this road. Now, since in our contemporary existence, finance is what mostly drives us, we will need to learn the language, but never lose sight for one moment or compromise on the true value of nature and its vital importance in the survival of life as we know it. Let's not go that way, is the point I'm trying to make here. Ironically, the just ended CBD COP, for those of you who've been following the CBD discussions in Hyderabad, is showing some progress in terms of the targets that were set in Japan. And the targets were popularly known as Aichi targets. The CBD was kicked off with the CBD Secretariat, and I think the President or the Minister in India called for champions in the world, champions who will lead the environmental sector, champions who will lead in the implementation of those targets that were set a few years back. But on the positive side, this inching slowly of implementing the targets that were set by nations, I think it's going in the right direction. And there's a commitment. There is a commitment, at least at that level, in those meetings about achieving the targets that were set globally on conserving biodiversity. However, just like last time, they're stuck on who pays for it. The financial sustainability was something that still hasn't been decided. Now, just as on the debate with the climate change funding, there are still differences on who, how much, and where it should go. Comes down to money. The point I'm trying to make, which is relevant, I think, to the title of this symposium, is that we must recognize the world and situation we face today. Priority in the minds of leaders of the world is not on the environment, and that's a fact. And we need to continue even harder to win equal and more recognition at all levels on the value of the environment in all that we do and plan for. And stop talking just to ourselves all the time. This is a message I try and convey in as many places that I am allowed to speak as possible. We need to talk to others. We need to convince others on why we think conservation is important to the very survival of mankind on the planet. This particular continent is even more pertinent in that regard. And as we maintain the speed and direction on the path towards prosperity, let us recognize that at no time in our history have we come so close to this point of tilting the balance between nature and man. And that's reality. We need to do more and to do all in our power to reverse this trend that we see globally and in particular in Africa. We must bring under control outside interests and ideologies while still addressing the needs of our people. Now, I listen and look with utter disbelief as development in many parts of our continent is carried out in literally every country, even today, in complete disregard to not only the environment but also stark evidence of climate change that we are seeing today. What more proof can we produce to get serious attention from decision makers, from politicians? Now, in desperation, and I've given these talks to a lot of politicians as well, and I do my best to try and get through to them to take the environment and the value of the environment as a very important factor in whatever development programs they have. But I've gone down to the level that I have to present graphic slides like this one. Just to try and make the point that global warming is real. It's not about a seasonal thing that we have floods this month and next year we won't have any. But, does this resonate with them? And I hope it works, ladies and gentlemen. Now, let me conclude by underlining, and I'm sorry if I didn't have many jokes for you, but I just wanted to point some things out, and I hope that it'll help you in your discussion, because when you talk about contemporary conservation, there are elements that you must remember and take into account. Now, let me underline the challenges facing us all as humanity on this continent. And for Africa, this is even more acute. Even with all the help we get from sincere partners from outside the continent, I put this particular line in because I thought there might be donors in the audience. We do have some sincere partners around the continent who are concerned about the environment. Now, it will not make much difference without us Africans taking responsibility fully as individuals, as a society, and as a community of nations. We have to take the lead. We have to take responsibility and accept things that might be going wrong as wrong and correct them. You know that Africa can be a leader. I believe so. But we need to take matters into our own hands, as I was saying, as Africans, and put the needs of our people and concerns about the environment among the top priorities to a secure future, doing one in varying degrees and not the other at all, is a sure way of self-destruction in many countries, if not as a continent. Thank you very much for your attention.